I don't normally talk about anime on this channel, even though I'm a huge fan. This is a gaming channel, so we talk about video games, but I'm making an exception today because if you are into video games, especially if you're into retro games, if you're old enough to remember arcade culture in the 90s, or if you have any sort of appreciation for video game history, you should watch this anime. I'm talking about High Score Girl. You can catch it on Netflix. This thing surprised me, and I gotta give a quick shout out to my buddy Galicide Ghoul for recommending this to me. I did not expect to love this thing as much as I did. In fact, it's one of my favorite things I've watched, period, in the past few years probably. It by far exceeded my expectations, and it's really just a love letter to video games and the culture and the history of video games. We're gonna get into all of that. I'd seen this on the recommendation feed on Netflix before, and I didn't think much of it. I was like, yeah, this looks kind of weird. Some little kids playing video games. I didn't think it was going to be that great. I saw the animation style, which it just looked a little bit weird. It had kind of that 3D CG look to it, which I'm not a fan of. But in this case, I don't mind at all. I think they did a really good job, and it was actually really necessary for this series, but we'll get into that in a bit. So High Score Girl follows this kid named Haruo Yaguchi, and we see him through pretty much elementary school all the way up through middle school and maybe high school, I think, toward the end. Basically, he starts out, he's this just little bratty kid. He's obsessed with video games. It's all he cares about, to the point where he doesn't really care about the people in his life. He kind of, pushes them aside. He ignores them. He doesn't do his homework because he's just playing games all the time. He gets in trouble at school for sneaking in his Game Boy. And, gaming is always on his mind. It's all he cares about. He doesn't just like playing games. He has to be amazing at every game too. He plays very competitively. Nobody can beat him at the arcades until Akira Ono, this girl. She's this pretty popular but quiet and mysterious girl. She's like a straight A student. Nobody expects her to be into games, but she shows up at the arcade one day and she beats him at Street Fighter. This sends Yaguchi into a furious rage. He's never lost to anybody. Nobody can beat him. Suddenly this girl walks in and she beats him. And this just drives him mad, and he makes it his goal pretty much that he's going to beat her. Thing is, she's amazing at every single game. She can't be beaten, and it drives him crazy. He hates her. She's his new rival. But eventually he realizes he doesn't hate her. In fact, he's really in love with her. He just doesn't understand that yet. Over the course of the series, we just see their relationship develop, and all kinds of crazy, emotional things happen. Family situations happen and get in the way of them and keep them apart for a while. And there's love triangles that begin happening and just all kinds of crazy stuff. And this kid's just a fool. You want to slap him so many times for just being idiotic and doing the wrong thing, or not, accepting or acknowledging his feelings and just being stupid. But you really see his character develop through the course of the series, and man, it's really, really good. This series made me laugh. It made me cry so many times. It's an emotional roller coaster, and it's just so darn good. But what does this have to do with games? Okay, yeah, it's a kid obsessed with games, but it goes so much deeper than that, because every single game in the series is a real game from real life, and we see the history of this. We see, Street Fighter, it plays a very important part of the series, to the point where we see actually characters from Street Fighter representing their consciences. We see Guile. He acts as Yaguchi's conscience. He's always appearing in his head and giving him life advice. And Zangief is similarly the conscience of Ono. So throughout the series, we're seeing these characters pop up and sort of speak in these characters' minds. But not only that, and this is why the whole, CGI animation was really necessary, because it shows real footage of all these games. And it's not just Street Fighter, it's dozens, if not hundreds, of real games shown in the series. They play Final Fight, they play Ghouls and Ghosts, they play Splatterhouse, they play Outrun, they play Dodonpachi, Darkstalkers, just so many games. And if they're not playing these games, you're seeing them running in the background. There was a poster for Forgotten Worlds in the back of one of the episodes, and I was like, oh, I love that game. It's a game nobody talks about anymore. People have forgotten about it, but it's here being, lovingly represented in this show. And we see the evolution of the video game industry throughout the series. It's not just arcade games. This kid's growing up with the PC Engine and the NES. Then we see the release of the Super NES, the Sega Genesis. It goes all the way up to the Sega Saturn, the PS1, and really all throughout the time we're seeing how these are just celebrated, and we're seeing the video game industry develop through the eyes of this starry-eyed kid, who just loves this stuff. He has a passion for this stuff, and he's talking about it as these games are coming out. We're seeing why this is so important, why this is so exciting. We're learning in-depth stuff about some of these games. Like, I'm a casual Street Fighter player. I grew up playing Street Fighter 2, but I didn't know about all these secrets in the games until it was shown in this series. I didn't know about particular strategies that are not acceptable in tournaments. I learned what turtling means and all this crazy stuff. But you learn so much about just these important historical video games, and it's just amazing. As somebody who's really, has a love for retro games, who grew up during this time, this anime was made for people like us, who are into games, who grew up during this time period, who remembers these games fondly. You get a real history lesson in the retro gaming industry, and you just see, there's that whole aspect combined with the whole humanity aspect and these relationships. Yaguchi's trying to figure out his own feelings for this girl who he thinks he doesn't like, but he really does like her, and there's another girl who likes him, but maybe he doesn't feel the same way. There's his friends who he's learning to care about and not just push them aside and ignore them for the video games. You see him really become a responsible young man over the course of things. He finds a reason in the people around him to, think beyond himself and put the games aside for once in his life, to work hard and study hard and try to steer his life into the direction where he needs to go. And man, it's just so good, man. It's so well written. The characters are all very lovable, even though, again, like I say, you might want to smack them around sometimes. It's just such a good series, man. Especially, like I say, if you're into video games at all, you absolutely must watch this. It's funny, I have a friend who plays competitive Street Fighter, and I was asking him about the show. I was like, hey, you know what, have you seen this show? This reminded me of you. And he was like, oh yeah, man. He's like, I always wanted to see something like that, and now it exists. It's just so cool. But like, it's not just me. It's talking to other people about this series, and they're like so impressed with this as well. And man, I tell you, it's just a must watch. I don't care if you like anime, that's great. Then you should absolutely watch this. If you don't normally watch anime, but you love retro gaming, then you absolutely need to watch this as well. It's just so good. You will laugh, you will cry, you will get way too emotionally involved in these characters, and you will hope and pray for a season 3, which I don't think is happening. At this point, I would love to see where it goes, and I'm not going to spoil anything. I just would love to get another season. We can see the characters a little bit older and see what happens to them, but I think it's done. I think that's left for our interpretation in a way. But there is a spin-off manga, I think it's called, what is it? Yeah, the spin-off manga is called High Score Girl Dash, but it centers around one of the side characters. I don't know if it has any references to what happens to our main characters in the future, but it is set in the future, and one of their friends is all grown up, and it's about that friend. I might have to check it out. I don't know if it's in English. I should have researched this earlier, but we're talking about the anime today, and yeah, it's just fantastic, honestly. Like I say, one of my favorite things I've watched in recent years, and that's not just anime, that's just overall. This thing had me so emotionally invested, and it just really stuck out to me because it's so unique. I mean, as a fan of anime and as a fan of retro games, and somebody just nostalgic about the whole arcade culture of that time period. I miss arcades. Sure, we still have a few, but it's not the same. arcades are hard to come by, and the ones that are out there, it's just different. It's a different vibe. It's not like back in the day. Back then, arcades were so exciting because they had unique games, and they ran on hardware that was more powerful than home consoles. So you went to arcades to play the absolute cutting edge technology, the absolute best games and the best quality, and there was just a real sense of kind of community at the arcades. There would be certain crowds of people that you would get to know, like my buddy I was talking about earlier who plays Street Fighter. I largely got to know him through hanging out at the arcade with groups of friends, and we would mingle. Yeah, I met a lot of people. Made a lot of friends at arcades back in the day, and it was just such a different culture at the time. You'd really get these serious, you know, nerds like myself who just really loved going and playing these games, hanging out there, socializing with people. And today I don't feel like it's like that. You have, you know, you have certain friends who go to arcades maybe and have some beers, play some casual games, but it's very, very different. And that's a discussion for another day, but just, it made me really long for that old arcade experience. And more than that, it's like, it's this coming of age story. It makes me nostalgic about my childhood, and it reminds me how old I am. But no, it's a heartwarming story. It's full of awesome video game references, and it's funny. It is heart-wrenching at times. Said this a bunch of times. Just go check it out, man. So shout out to Galicide Ghoul for recommending this. I'm going to put his channel down below. Go give him some support, give him some love, and yeah, let me know what you think. Have you watched High Score Girl? Have you read any of the manga? Do you know if I'm missing out on anything by not reading it? That's usually the case. Usually manga goes way more in depth than the anime can, but that's all I got to say. I'm just rambling on now. So without wasting any more of your time, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.